Why Satan and angel Michael battled for Moses' body. Moses, the God-made God in the midst of mere men. Imagine a world where battles aren't fought with swords and shields, but in the unseen realms, where angels and demons clash in a war that spans beyond time and space. A world where the body of a man, yes, a mere mortal, holds such power that even the most formidable forces in the universe, including Satan himself, would battle for possession of it. This is the story of Moses, the man who stood as God's mouthpiece to Pharaoh, who parted seas and called down fire from heaven, the man who spoke with God face to face. Yet, his story didn't end in victory as expected. Instead, it ended in mystery. As the great leader of Israel climbed to the mountaintop to die, something strange occurred, something that would spark a fierce dispute in the heavens. For his body was not just any body. It was a vessel that carried the power of God. But why, after all Moses had accomplished, did Satan go to war with the archangel Michael over it? Why, with all his plans and plots, did Satan desire something as seemingly insignificant as the body of a dead man? Moses, a man who had seen God's glory, a man whose anger once led him to strike the rock and forfeit his own entry into the promised land, left behind a legacy that even Satan couldn't ignore. There was something about Moses, even in death, that posed a threat to the forces of darkness. But why? What made Moses' body so special? What was so significant about the end of his life that it warranted such a spiritual battle? An unseen war fought in the heavens themselves. As the clouds parted and Moses died in solitude on Mount Nebo, buried by God himself, something deep and profound was happening. Satan wanted to claim that body, and Michael, God's appointed defender, stood in the way. What followed was more than a battle of wills. It was a cosmic struggle with eternal implications. Hold on tight, because what you're about to uncover isn't just about a prophet's death. It's about the very nature of spiritual authority, the power of God's chosen, and the celestial forces that fought to control what God had made sacred. This is a story of betrayal, divine judgment, and an ancient battle that reaches beyond death itself. Are you ready to uncover why Satan fought Michael for Moses' body? The truth will stir your soul. Before we go deeper into the raw, deep, and untold mysteries behind Moses' body, take a second to click the subscribe button, share, and like this video. Turn on the notification bell to be notified for more powerful mysteries in the Bible and this life. Now let's continue. The power of Moses. Few names in history resonate with the kind of power Moses does. He wasn't just any man. He was a man who stood before the most powerful ruler on earth, Pharaoh, and declared with unwavering confidence, "Let my people go." This was no ordinary command. This was the voice of God speaking through a man who had experienced firsthand the raw power of the Almighty. But what was it that made Moses not just a man, but a vessel of divine authority? Why was he chosen for a mission so monumental that it would shape the course of an entire nation, and indeed, history itself? Moses was born in a time of intense oppression, a time when his people, the Israelites, languished under the harsh rule of Pharaoh. Yet, from the very moment of his birth, there was something special about him. It wasn't just his survival of Pharaoh's decree to kill all Hebrew male infants. It wasn't just his being rescued from the Nile by Pharaoh's daughter, raised in the palace, and groomed for greatness. It was something deeper, something invisible to the human eye, but known to the divine. For God, in his perfect timing, called Moses to a task greater than any mortal could fathom. He was chosen to be the deliverer of God's people, the man who would lead them out of bondage and into the promise of freedom. But Moses' power wasn't merely political or physical. It wasn't about the strength of his arm or the sharpness of his mind. It was about his relationship with God. Moses had something no one else had: direct access to God himself. We often read about the prophets of old, but none had the privilege Moses did. He spoke to God face to face. Exodus 33 verse 11 tells us, the Lord would speak to Moses face to face, as one speaks to a friend. Think about that for a moment. Imagine having such an intimate connection with the Creator that you could converse with him like a friend, not just in moments of desperation, but as a regular, everyday occurrence. God spoke directly to Moses, giving him instructions, revelations, and guidance that would lead Israel through the wilderness. He even placed his power upon Moses, turning him into an instrument of divine intervention. When Moses raised his staff, the seas parted. When he called out to God, plagues of locust, frogs, and darkness descended upon Egypt, each one a sign of God's judgment upon Pharaoh and the gods of Egypt. And when Moses struck the rock at God's command, water poured forth, sustaining the people in the desert. This wasn't just a man. This was a man whom God had made a god before kings and rulers. Exodus 7 verse 1 states, Then the Lord said to Moses, See, I have made you like God to Pharaoh. This was a man who carried such authority that when he stood before Pharaoh, it was as though God himself stood there. Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, the god king in his own eyes, had to bow before Moses' power. This wasn't about Moses' own strength. It was about the divine power that flowed through him. But Moses' power wasn't limited to his role as the leader of Israel. Moses' influence stretched beyond what he could see. He had a unique ability to mediate between God and the people. When Israel sinned, when they turned to idols or grumbled against God, it was Moses who interceded on their behalf. When the people deserved judgment, Moses, with the weight of God's power, pleaded for mercy. And God, moved by Moses' plea, relented. Exodus 32 verse 14 tells us, Then the Lord relented and did not bring on his people the disaster he had threatened. What we see here isn't just the heart of a leader. It's the heart of a man who had been entrusted with divine power and used it not for his own gain, but for the salvation of others. Even in his personal struggles, Moses displayed a power that could not be denied. Despite his temper, his insecurities, and his doubts, God worked through him. Moses was not a flawless man. In fact, he had a temper that sometimes caused him to act in haste. In Numbers 20-10-12, when Moses struck the rock out of frustration, he forfeited the promise of entering the promised land. Yet, even in his failure, God's purpose was never thwarted. Moses' power lay not in his perfection, but in his willingness to submit to God's will, despite his mistakes. But even the great Moses wasn't immune to the price of disobedience. God had called him to speak to the rock, to demonstrate faith and trust in him. But instead, Moses let his anger take hold, striking the rock with his staff. This single act of disobedience resulted in one of the most profound consequences in Moses' life. He was not permitted to enter the promised land. The very land he had spent his life fighting to see his people inherit was denied to him. Numbers 20:12 says, But the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, Because you did not trust in me enough to honor me as holy in the sight of the Israelites, you will not bring this community into the land I give them. Here we see the complexity of Moses' power. His divine authority was immense, but it didn't come without responsibility. The power he wielded was not his own. It was God's power flowing through him. And in the end, even Moses had to submit to God's judgment. The fact that Moses didn't enter the promised land serves as a sobering reminder that divine power is not about personal glory, but about faithfully carrying out God's will, no matter the personal cost. But even in death, Moses was far from powerless. His influence did not die with him. Moses had poured out God's gifts upon 70 men, anointed to carry out the work of God's kingdom. This moment recorded in Numbers 11:24-25, shows that Moses' power wasn't just in his leadership, but in his ability to empower others. Moses' spirit, his wisdom, his relationship with God. These were gifts he poured out upon others, allowing them to share in the mission God had given him. And so even after Moses' death, the power of his life continues to resonate. The power of Moses wasn't just about miracles and divine encounters. It was about his deep, unshakable connection with God. His authority granted by God was not a mere earthly power. It was a power that reached into eternity. Moses was a man who stood between heaven and earth, wielding the authority of God himself. In the end, Moses wasn't just a man who led Israel. He was a man who embodied the very power of God, a power that would echo through history and remain a beacon for all who seek to understand the nature of divine authority. Moses was indeed a living testimony to the fact that when God chooses to pour out his power on a person, that person becomes a force to be reckoned with, a power that can part seas, overthrow kingdoms, and as we will soon see, even stir up battles in the heavenly realms. Moses' temper and mistakes. The story of Moses is one of immense power and miraculous feats, yet it is also a tale of human frailty and imperfection. For all his greatness, Moses was not immune to the same flaws that plague us all. In fact, it was in his greatest moments of anger and frustration that his true character was revealed, showing that even the most divinely chosen men have their weaknesses. But what happens when a man, chosen by God to lead a nation, loses control of his temper? What happens when a man who has spoken to God face to face is pushed beyond his limits? The first hint of Moses' volatile nature surfaces in Egypt, long before he ever stood before Pharaoh. In Exodus 2 verses 11-12, we learn that Moses, in his anger, struck down an Egyptian slave master who was beating a Hebrew. This act of violence was not just a sudden outburst. It was the beginning of a pattern that would surface time and again throughout his life. Moses was a man of action, yes, but when his temper flared, it often led to consequences that would ripple through his life and his mission. His impatience and anger would later become more pronounced when he led the Israelites out of Egypt. For 40 years, Moses was the one to guide God's people through the wilderness. But the journey was far from easy. The people of Israel, ungrateful and rebellious, tested Moses at every turn. They grumbled about food, they questioned his leadership, and they even longed to return to Egypt. And it was during these times, when the people's discontent reached its peak, that Moses' temper would erupt. The most glaring example of Moses' fiery anger is recorded in Numbers 20:10-12. The people were once again complaining about a lack of water. They had seen God's power at work in their lives, water from the rock, manna from heaven, and quail to satisfy their hunger. But still they murmured. In his frustration, Moses gathered the people, and instead of speaking to the rock as God had commanded, he struck it with his staff twice. In that moment, Moses didn't just strike the rock. He struck at his own character. He let his emotions override God's command. It wasn't a minor mistake. Moses had been entrusted with the very word of God. His actions were to reflect God's holiness to the people. And yet, in his anger, Moses failed to honor God's instructions. God, in his wisdom, had a purpose for Moses. But Moses' disobedience carried a heavy cost. God told him plainly in Numbers 20:12, "Because you did not trust in me enough to honor me as holy in the sight of the Israelites, you will not bring this community into the land I give them." Imagine that. Moses, who had given so much of his life to God's service, who had witnessed so many miracles, was told that he would never enter the promised land because of a moment of uncontrolled anger. The consequence wasn't just personal. It was deeply symbolic. A man who had led God's people out of Egypt, parting seas and calling down plagues, was now being told that his failure to reflect God's holiness, even in his most trying moments, would cost him everything. The land he had dreamed of entering was not to be his. But here's the twist in Moses' story. His temper wasn't the only mistake that shaped his life. Moses had his share of doubts, fears, and insecurities that stemmed from something deeper than just a short fuse. This man who had spoken directly with God, who had led armies and witnessed God's glory, still wrestled with his own self-worth. He struggled with a deep sense of inadequacy that often led him to question his ability to fulfill God's call. Take, for instance, the moment when Moses stood before the burning bush and protested God's call to deliver Israel from Egypt. Exodus 3 verse 11 shows Moses questioning God, saying, "Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt?" Despite God's assurances, Moses doubted his own worthiness, his abilities, and his calling. This wasn't the response of a man full of confidence. It was a cry of insecurity from someone who feared he wasn't enough. Moses' temper was but a symptom of a larger inner conflict, a man caught between his divine calling and his own sense of failure. It's easy to look at Moses as a larger-than-life figure, but when we peel back the layers, we find a man who, like all of us, wrestled with his flaws. His mistakes were not just acts of disobedience, but windows into the complexity of his humanity. Moses was a man who knew the weight of divine authority, but he also knew the sting of his own limitations. This brings us to the ultimate mistake of Moses' life, the one that would cost him his entry into the Promised Land. God had called him to lead, but Moses had failed to fully honor God's instructions in his moment of frustration. The rock wasn't just a rock. It was a divine symbol. By striking it in anger, Moses demonstrated a lack of trust in God's provision and holiness. God had commanded Moses to speak to the rock, but in his frustration, Moses allowed his own pride and temper to stand in the way of obedience. At the end of his life, as Moses stood on the edge of the land he had fought for, God told him it was time to die. He would not enter the Promised Land. And though Moses pleaded with God to change his mind, the decision was final. Deuteronomy 3 verses 23 to 27 records Moses' plea. "Let me go over and see the good land beyond the Jordan, that fine hill country in Lebanon." But God's answer was no. Why was Moses, who had been so faithful, denied this final promise? It was because even in the grandest of victories, we are still called to walk in complete obedience to God. His anger was not merely a failure of control. It was a failure to trust fully in God's way and God's timing. Moses' temper and mistakes reveal a deeper truth, that even those chosen by God are not immune to human flaws. His life is a mirror, showing us that our greatest potential is not in our perfection, but in our willingness to grow, to learn from our mistakes, and to submit ourselves to God's will, no matter the cost. The great leader Moses wasn't perfect, but perhaps that's what makes his story so powerful. It's not the flawless man we admire, but the man who, despite his flaws, became a vessel for God's glory. And perhaps, just perhaps, it's in our own imperfections that God can do his greatest work. The mysterious death of Moses. There's a mystery that surrounds the death of Moses, one that's unlike any other in the Bible. It's not just the fact that he died after leading the Israelites for 40 years, nor is it just that he died on a mountain, but the way it all happened, the way his life and death remain veiled in divine secrecy. This wasn't a death that came quietly in his sleep, nor did it occur in the company of loved ones. It was, in fact, a death shrouded in enigma, a death orchestrated by God himself, one that raised more questions than it answered. Imagine the scene. Moses, the man who had seen God's glory face to face, the man who had heard God's voice like no one else, stands on the edge of the Promised Land. For 40 years, he led Israel through the wilderness. He had spoken to God in the burning bush, parted seas, delivered plagues, and carried the law of God down from the mountain. He had been the instrument through which God performed some of the most magnificent miracles in history. And yet, As Moses gazed upon the land he had longed to enter, God told him, "You will not cross over into the land." Instead, Moses was commanded to go up to Mount Nebo, to die there alone. But here's the twist, the most baffling part of it all. God himself buried Moses, the man who had been the shepherd to God's people, the one who had led them with such power and authority, would be buried by the very hands of God. The Bible says in Deuteronomy 34, verses 5 to 6, "And Moses, the servant of the Lord, died there in Moab, as the Lord had said. He buried him in Moab, in the valley opposite Beth-peor. But to this day, no one knows where his grave is." What is this? A death unlike any other. A burial that remains a mystery to this day. The man who had stood before Pharaoh and declared God's will, who had led the people through impossible odds, would be placed in a grave, and no one, no mortal, would ever find it. Why did God choose such secrecy for Moses' final resting place? What was it about Moses' death that required it to be hidden from the eyes of men? The implications are staggering. You see, Moses wasn't just any man. His body held significance beyond what we can comprehend. It wasn't just a man who died. It was the death of God's chosen servant, one whose influence reached into eternity. And as Moses died on Mount Nebo, something deeper was happening. Moses, the great leader, the mediator between God and Israel, was being removed from the earthly realm in a way that no one could trace, no one could touch. His body wasn't just a body, it was a symbol of the covenant between God and his people, a symbol of God's judgment, but also his mercy. And then there's the final, most profound detail. Satan wanted Moses' body. This is where the story takes a dark turn. The Bible tells us in Jude 1 verse 9 that the archangel Michael disputed with Satan over Moses' body. Why would Satan care about the body of a dead man? Why would he want to claim it so badly that he would fight Michael, God's chosen warrior? The answer lies in the significance of Moses' body as a symbol of divine authority. Satan, who constantly seeks to corrupt and defile God's creation, understood that Moses, even in death, represented something sacred. To claim Moses' body would be a victory over God's chosen servant, a way to defile the sanctity of God's divine will. But why was Michael sent to fight? Was Michael Moses' personal angel? Some scholars believe that Michael's role as a protector of God's people makes him the natural defender of Moses' body. But what's more compelling is the fact that Michael didn't just battle Satan over a body. He fought for something much more profound, the integrity of God's will. If Satan had taken Moses' body, it would have symbolized the ultimate defilement of God's purpose. By intervening, Michael preserved the holiness of God's plan. This battle, however, raises more questions than it answers. What exactly was Satan's plan in wanting Moses' body? Was it simply to corrupt it, to desecrate something sacred, or was there something more strategic at play? Could it be that Moses, even in death, was a powerful spiritual weapon? A weapon that Satan knew could never be fully eradicated. Even if he gained control of it, Moses' death was not just the end of his life. It marked the end of an era for Israel. But it also set the stage for something greater, something that would come centuries later. As Moses died and was hidden by God, Israel looked to the future. The promised land awaited, but it would not be Moses who would lead them in. Instead, Joshua would take his place. Moses' death was a reminder that no man, no matter how powerful, could stand in the way of God's ultimate plan. Moses' physical death was the end of his leadership, but the eternal impact of his life would never be erased. In this final act of God's mysterious dealings with Moses, we see something that transcends death itself. Moses was more than a man. He was a symbol of divine authority, of covenant, of the law, and his death, wrapped in mystery, tells us that some things belong to God alone. Some things, like Moses' body, are so sacred, so powerful, that even Satan can't have them. The death of Moses isn't just a historical event, but a window into the spiritual realm, a realm where God's sovereignty reigns, where Satan's schemes are thwarted, and where the mysteries of life and death intertwine in ways we can barely understand. But one thing is certain: Moses' death, though shrouded in secrecy, speaks louder than words. It speaks of divine purpose, of spiritual warfare, and of the eternal plan that no one can thwart. Why Satan fought over Moses' body? Picture this: the death of Moses, a man who had stood in the very presence of God, who had spoken with him face to face, is marked by a silence so deep, so mysterious, that it echoes through the ages. But the quiet that followed Moses' death was not just a moment of mourning for a leader. No, something far darker was unfolding in the spiritual realms. A battle had begun. A battle over something that at first glance seemed so insignificant: the body of a dead man. Why would Satan care so much about a body, especially the body of someone who had already passed from this world? Why would he go to war with the archangel Michael, the protector of God's people, for the possession of Moses' lifeless form? It's a question that digs deep into the very nature of spiritual warfare, into the heart of Satan's relentless pursuit to corrupt everything God has created, especially that which carries his divine purpose. The first key to understanding this battle lies in the nature of Moses himself. Moses wasn't just a prophet. He was a symbol. He embodied the law. He was the deliverer of God's covenant. When Moses spoke, it was as if God himself was speaking. The miracles Moses performed were not just acts of power. They were signs of God's sovereign authority over creation. To take Moses' body was not just to possess a lifeless shell. It was to claim victory over God's chosen vessel. It was a battle for something far more significant than flesh and bone. It was a battle for the legacy, the authority, and the spiritual weight that Moses carried. Moses as the representation of God's covenant. Moses wasn't just a man chosen to lead Israel. He was a living embodiment of God's covenant with his people. His very existence was tied to the promises God made to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. When God made his covenant with Israel, it was Moses who stood as the mediator. Through Moses, God delivered the 10 Commandments, establishing the law that would govern the people of Israel for centuries. Moses' role wasn't just to lead, it was to define, to give structure, to be the mouthpiece of the divine will. And that is precisely why Satan desired his body. Moses' body represented the covenant itself. By fighting for it, Satan sought to claim dominion over the very symbol of God's relationship with his people. Satan had already tried countless times to corrupt God's covenant and his people. But here in the body of Moses was a tangible connection to God's law, a direct line to the sacred, unbreakable promises of God. To possess Moses' body was to make a statement. Satan was laying claim to something that belonged to God alone. The battle for spiritual authority. Satan's rebellion in heaven, his desire to usurp God's throne, has always been rooted in his lust for authority. It wasn't enough for Satan to merely be a fallen angel. He sought the very power of God. That same desire for power drove his every move. The body of Moses, though dead, was more than just the shell of a man. It was a symbol of divine authority. To Satan, possessing Moses' body was not just about desecrating the remains of a man. It was about undermining the very authority of God. Moses had stood as the earthly representative of God's power. When he raised his staff, the Red Sea parted. When he spoke, God's voice was heard. His authority was undeniable, and it came directly from God. Satan, always seeking to mock and challenge God's sovereignty, saw an opportunity to strike at the very heart of divine authority. By laying claim to Moses' body, he sought to corrupt and claim dominion over what was sacred, to rob God of the symbol of his own power. But God, in his divine wisdom, would not allow such a desecration. And that's where Michael, the archangel, came in. It wasn't just a simple dispute over a body. It was a cosmic showdown, a battle for the sanctity of divine authority itself. The cosmic importance of the body. Why didn't Satan just take the body of any other prophet? Why Moses? The answer lies in the extraordinary role Moses played in God's plan for salvation. Moses was the lawgiver, the man who stood between God and the people of Israel, the one who interceded when Israel sinned. His body, even in death, carried weight. It was the physical manifestation of a covenant that had shaped Israel's identity. It was a symbol of God's faithfulness, his judgment, and his mercy, all wrapped into one. Moses was also a type of Christ. His life foreshadowed the coming of the Savior. Moses delivered God's people from slavery in Egypt, just as Christ would later deliver humanity from sin. The parallels are unmistakable. Moses, a deliverer, a lawgiver, and an intercessor. To Satan, possessing Moses' body wasn't just about making a physical claim. It was about stealing a piece of God's redemptive plan. Satan understood the spiritual gravity of what Moses represented. If he could corrupt Moses' body, he could tarnish the very symbol of salvation that Moses embodied, the defilement of the sacred. Satan's tactics are always aimed at defiling what is holy. It's his modus operandi, from the Garden of Eden to the temptation of Christ in the wilderness. He doesn't just want to destroy. He wants to corrupt, to turn what is good into something unclean, something that no longer reflects God's holiness. The body of Moses, now dead and buried, was sacred. It carried the weight of God's covenant, the law, and the legacy of deliverance. To Satan, claiming it would have been the ultimate act of corruption. It would have been a way to distort the legacy of Moses, to taint the very symbol of God's power on earth. Why Michael was sent to fight, but God would not allow Moses' body to be defiled. The archangel Michael, known as the protector of God's people, was dispatched to battle Satan and prevent him from claiming Moses' body. This wasn't just a fight over a dead man's remains. It was a fight for the sanctity of divine authority. Michael, acting on God's behalf, stood as the defender of God's holiness and the protector of his covenant. Michael's victory wasn't just a personal triumph. It was a declaration that no power, not even Satan himself, could lay claim to what belonged to God. This battle was a direct challenge to Satan's rebellion, and it was a reminder to all of us that God's plan cannot be thwarted, even by the most insidious forces of darkness. Satan may try to claim dominion over what is sacred, but God's power will always prevail. In the end, the fight over Moses' body was not just about possession. It was about the preservation of God's truth, God's covenant, and God's plan for salvation. Satan's desire to claim Moses' body was a direct attack on the very authority of God, and Michael's intervention ensured that the sanctity of Moses' life, death, and legacy remained intact. The body of Moses, though hidden from human eyes, was preserved by God, and in that preservation, we see the ultimate triumph of divine authority over the forces of darkness. The angel Michael's role in the battle. The air was thick with tension, the heavens themselves holding their breath. A cosmic battle was about to unfold, a battle that would determine not just the fate of a body, but the preservation of divine authority itself. In one corner stood Satan, the accuser, the fallen archangel, whose ambition had once led him to challenge the throne of God. In the other corner stood Michael, the archangel, the protector of God's people, the warrior who had fought in the heavenly realms long before this world was even created. This was not a fight between two equals. It was a battle between the forces of light and darkness, between God's unshakable will and Satan's insidious desire to corrupt everything sacred. But why Michael? Why was he the one sent to fight Satan over the body of Moses? Was Michael just another angel? Or was there something uniquely powerful, something divinely appointed about his role in this battle? The answers to these questions reveal a deeper truth about spiritual warfare. about the protection of what is holy and the preservation of God's ultimate plan. Michael, more than just a warrior. Before we understand why Michael was chosen, it's crucial to understand who Michael really is. Michael is not just another celestial being in the angelic hierarchy. He is the commander of God's heavenly army, the one who stands as a defender of God's people, and the one chosen to protect the sacred. His very name, Michael, means who is like God, a name that speaks to his nature, his unwavering loyalty to God, and his role as the one who will always stand in defense of what God deems precious. The Bible introduces us to Michael in several places, but it's in the book of Daniel that his role as a protector becomes most apparent. In Daniel 10, verse 13, Michael is described as one of the chief princes who comes to the aid of a lesser angel, defeating the forces that are holding him captive. Michael's presence in the heavenly courts is not just a matter of protocol. He is a warrior. He is the one sent to guard God's people against the forces of darkness. He doesn't just defend God's kingdom. He is the one who actively engages in battle on behalf of God's purposes. This is why Michael was the natural choice to intervene in the dispute over Moses' body. Moses wasn't just any man. He was the representative of God's covenant, a man whose life and death had monumental implications for the future of Israel. The very act of Moses dying, of his body being hidden by God, carried a deep spiritual significance. It was Michael's divine responsibility to ensure that Moses' body remained sacred and untouched by Satan's defiling influence. The spiritual significance of the battle. Moses was no ordinary man. His death wasn't just the end of a life, it was the end of an era. He had been the one who had led Israel through the wilderness, the one who had interceded for them time and again. But more than that, Moses represented the law. He had delivered the 10 Commandments, establishing the covenant between God and Israel. His body, even in death, was a symbol of God's covenant with his people, a symbol that Satan could not tolerate. By seeking to claim Moses' body, Satan wasn't just attempting to desecrate a human body. He was attempting to destroy the very symbol of divine authority. And this is where Michael's role becomes clear. Michael was not just defending Moses' body because it was Moses. He was defending God's authority, the sanctity of the covenant, and the very foundation of God's redemptive plan. The body of Moses, even in death, was a representation of God's will. It was sacred, and in a battle where Satan sought to corrupt it, Michael stood as the protector, the one who would not allow the forces of darkness to have their way. Michael's role as a spiritual warrior. In Revelation 12 verses 7 to 9, we read of Michael's decisive role in the ultimate battle between the forces of good and evil. And there was war in heaven. Michael and his angels fought against the dragon, and the dragon and his angels fought back. But he was not strong enough, and they lost their place in heaven. This passage reveals not only Michael's authority in the heavenly realm, but also his role as a spiritual warrior. Michael doesn't just defend God's people. He actively fights against Satan's forces. His very presence on the battlefield represents God's victory over the forces of evil. This same role as a warrior was required in the dispute over Moses' body. Michael wasn't merely a passive bystander in this cosmic showdown. He was the one who took action. When Satan sought to claim what was sacred, Michael stepped forward, representing the heavenly army and the divine will of God. His intervention was not just to protect Moses' body. It was to ensure that God's purpose for Moses, for Israel, and for all of humanity would not be tainted by Satan's schemes. Why Michael and not another angel? It's important to ask, why was Michael specifically chosen for this task? Why not another angel, a lesser celestial being who could have intervened? The answer lies in Michael's unique role in the divine order. In Daniel 12 verse 1, we are told that Michael is the protector of God's people. At that time, Michael, the great prince who protects your people, will arise. His role is not just to fight battles. It is to defend the holiness of God's people and the purposes of God's kingdom. Moses was the leader of God's people, the one who had led them through the wilderness and had been the mouthpiece of God's law. His death marked the end of an era, and Michael's role was to ensure that this transition was protected from Satan's corruption. The cosmic significance of Moses' death required the intervention of the highest spiritual authority in the heavenly realm. Michael's unique role as a protector, a warrior, and a defender of God's will made him the only one capable of engaging in such a battle. The victory of divine authority. The battle between Michael and Satan over Moses' body wasn't just about a dead man's remains. It was a battle for the preservation of God's sovereignty. In the end, Michael triumphed. He didn't just protect Moses' body. He protected the sanctity of God's will. The body of Moses was hidden, and the covenant remained intact. This victory was a declaration that no matter how much Satan sought to destroy, to defile, or to claim what was sacred, God's authority would always prevail. Michael's victory wasn't just a celestial battle. It was a reminder to us all that the forces of darkness cannot stand against the will of God. When God's purposes are in motion, no power, no matter how formidable, can stop them. Why the body of Moses was so important to God and to Satan. What is it about the body of a dead man that could stir such a fierce celestial battle? Why would Satan risk a direct confrontation with the archangel Michael, an angel of unparalleled power, for possession of Moses' lifeless form? It seems, at first glance, like an absurd question. The body of a man, after all, is nothing but dust, flesh, and bone, decaying and temporary. Yet in the cosmic realm, where battles are fought over more than just physical possessions, there was something profoundly significant about Moses' body, something that both God and Satan recognized. Moses wasn't just any man, and his death wasn't just the end of a physical life. His body represented something far greater, something that transcended mortality. But what exactly was at stake? Why would Satan go to war over a body that no longer lived? And why would God protect it so fiercely? To understand this battle, we need to explore the immense spiritual and symbolic weight carried by Moses' life, death, and body. The body of Moses as a symbol of God's covenant. Moses' body wasn't just the shell of a man. It was the living symbol of God's covenant with Israel. When Moses descended from Mount Sinai with the stone tablets, carrying the very law of God, it wasn't just a physical object. It was a representation of the relationship between God and his people. For Moses, who had led Israel out of Egypt, had witnessed God's glory, and had stood as the mediator between God and Israel. To die was not simply the end of a journey. It was the end of an era. His body, even in death, carried the weight of that covenant. In Deuteronomy 34, verse 9, we are told that Moses' successor, Joshua, was filled with the spirit of wisdom because Moses had laid his hands on him. Moses wasn't just the leader of Israel. He was the one who established the law, the one who laid the foundation for Israel's identity as God's people. His body was a sacred relic of God's promise, the living testimony of the covenant that defined Israel. By battling for Moses' body, Satan wasn't just fighting for a physical possession. He was fighting for the symbolic heart of God's relationship with his people. Satan's desire to defile the sacred. From the very beginning of time, Satan has been engaged in a relentless campaign to defile what is holy, to corrupt what God has declared sacred. His fall from grace was not just an act of rebellion. It was an attempt to usurp God's throne and seize control of the divine order. In the garden, Satan sought to corrupt the very nature of humanity by convincing Adam and Eve to rebel against God. And throughout history, Satan has tried to corrupt every aspect of God's creation, from the human heart to the very earth itself. The body of Moses was no different. Why did Satan want Moses' body? To him, it was more than just the remains of a great man. It was the last physical link to the covenant that defined God's relationship with his people. Moses had been the one to carry the law of God, the one to intercede on behalf of the Israelites, the one to stand in God's presence on their behalf. By claiming Moses' body, Satan could defile that link. He could tarnish the legacy of God's covenant and, in doing so, undermine the entire plan of redemption that God had set in motion through Moses and the Israelites. Satan, with his insatiable desire to corrupt, understood that Moses' body was more than just flesh. It was a symbol of divine authority, a piece of God's kingdom that no one, not even the forces of darkness, had the right to claim. By fighting for Moses' body, Satan wasn't just seeking a trophy. He was trying to desecrate something sacred. He wanted to rob God of a powerful symbol of his authority, a symbol that had been built through the life, death, and covenant of Moses. The body of Moses as the pinnacle of God's authority. God had entrusted Moses with authority that no other man in Israel would ever know. He was the one who had stood before Pharaoh and declared God's will. He was the one who had led the Israelites through the wilderness, the one who had mediated between a sinful people and a holy God. And even in his death, Moses remained the embodiment of God's sovereignty over Israel. His body, therefore, was not just a mortal vessel. It was the pinnacle of God's earthly authority. To Satan, possessing it was more than just a conquest. It was an attempt to usurp that authority. When Moses died and was buried by God himself, it wasn't just the end of a life. It was the closure of an era. Moses had been the foundation of the law, the symbol of God's covenant with Israel. By claiming his body, Satan could challenge God's claim to that authority. Satan has always sought to defy God's will, to undermine God's sovereignty, and to place his own will above the Creator's. By fighting for Moses' body, Satan sought to take control of a divine symbol that represented God's unyielding rule. Why God protected Moses' body? In response to Satan's desire to claim Moses' body, God's intervention was swift and decisive. The battle for Moses' body wasn't just about a dead man's remains. It was a battle for the preservation of God's authority and his divine plan. Michael the archangel was sent to confront Satan, and he did so with the power of God behind him. But why was God so determined to protect Moses' body? Wasn't Moses just a man? The answer lies in the sacredness of Moses' role and the covenant he represented. Moses' body was a holy relic, a physical embodiment of the law, of the promise, and of the connection between God and his people. For God to allow Satan to claim it would have been to allow the defilement of his covenant, his law, and his plan for Israel. God understood that the spiritual ramifications of such a loss would be catastrophic, not just for Israel, but for all of humanity. By protecting Moses' body, God demonstrated that his authority would not be challenged, that his covenant would not be defiled, and that his purposes would always stand, no matter how much Satan tried to disrupt them. The body of Moses, hidden by God, remained a symbol of the sanctity of the law and the covenant, a symbol that could not be touched by the forces of darkness, a battle for the legacy of God's people. In the end, the battle over Moses' body was a battle for more than just a man. It was a battle for the very heart of God's people. Moses' body represented the law, the covenant, and the divine authority that God had established with Israel. Satan's desire to defile it was an attempt to undermine the entire foundation of God's redemptive plan. But Michael's intervention and God's protection ensured that Moses' body, like the covenant it represented, would remain untouchable by Satan's schemes. Through this celestial battle, we see a profound truth. Satan's attempts to defile and corrupt are never just about physical things. They are about spiritual authority. The battle for Moses' body was a direct attack on God's sovereignty, and by preserving it, God made a powerful statement. His will would always prevail, his promises would remain intact, and his covenant with his people would never be shaken. The body of Moses, even in death, was a testament to the power and authority of the God who had chosen him, and it was a symbol that Satan would never be able to claim. Why the body of Moses was so important to God and to Satan. The battle for Moses' body though fought in the unseen realms, reverberated with cosmic consequences. It wasn't just about the body of a man who had passed from this world. It was about what that body represented. Moses was no ordinary man. He wasn't merely a leader, a prophet, or a lawgiver. His life, his body, and even his death carried a weight so profound that both God and Satan recognized its power. But why? Why would Satan, whose pride and rebellion had already lost him everything, risk a direct confrontation with the archangel Michael for the remains of Moses? Why would the Creator himself ensure that Moses' body was hidden and protected, never to be seen by human eyes? To answer these questions, we need to peer deeper into the spiritual and symbolic significance of Moses' life, and why in the spiritual realm his body was more than just flesh. It was the symbol of divine authority. The body of Moses, a symbol of the covenant. Moses' life was intricately tied to the covenant that God made with Israel. When God chose Moses to lead his people out of Egypt, he wasn't just selecting a political figure or a military leader. Moses was a living representation of the law, the very essence of God's covenant with his people. The 10 Commandments that Moses received on Mount Sinai were more than just a set of moral guidelines. They were a declaration of God's rule over Israel. They were the terms of a divine contract, given by God to Moses to pass on to his people. Moses' life was the living embodiment of this covenant. So, when Moses died, it wasn't just the death of a leader. It was the end of an era. The man who had been the intermediary between God and his people, the one who had delivered the law, was now gone. But even in death, Moses' body carried the weight of that covenant. To Satan, who had spent millennia trying to corrupt and undermine the work of God, Moses' body was more than just a lifeless shell. It was a potent symbol, a symbol of God's law, of his authority, and of his covenant with Israel. For Satan, possessing Moses' body was not just a matter of physical conquest. It was a spiritual attack. By taking the body, Satan would not only desecrate the remains of God's servant, he would defile the very symbol of God's covenant. He knew that Moses' body was sacred, that it represented God's sovereignty and his unbreakable promises. To claim it was to mock the very authority of God, Satan's unyielding desire to defile what is holy. From the very beginning, Satan's rebellion in heaven was not just an act of defiance. It was an attempt to usurp God's throne. Satan desired not only to be like God, but to dethrone him altogether. His pride and ambition drove him to a war that ended with his expulsion from heaven. But Satan didn't stop there. His war with God didn't end with his fall. It continued on earth, in the hearts of men and women, in the very creation that God had made. His mission was clear: corrupt and defile whatever God deemed holy, disrupt God's plan, and claim victory over his creation. Moses' body, even in death, was a powerful symbol of God's unyielding authority. It wasn't just the body of a man. It was the physical representation of God's divine law, the bridge between the sacred and the earthly. To Satan, defiling Moses' body was another attempt to strike at God's power. It wasn't about possession for possession's sake. It was about control. By desecrating Moses' body, Satan could taint the symbol of God's law and the legacy of a covenant. It was a spiritual blow, an attempt to disrupt God's plans and rewrite the narrative of salvation. Moses had been God's chosen deliverer, the one who stood between Israel and Pharaoh, the one who saw God face to face. His body was a holy relic, a living connection to the divine. And Satan, in his eternal quest to corrupt and destroy, understood that to claim that body was to strike at the very heart of God's redemptive plan. It was an attempt to undermine the authority that Moses had carried, to show that even the most faithful servant of God could be conquered by the forces of darkness. The body of Moses, a battle for spiritual authority. At the core of this battle is not just the physical body of Moses, but what it represented: divine authority. Moses had been the conduit through which God's power flowed. He had been the lawgiver, the mediator between Israel and God. When Moses raised his staff, the Red Sea parted. When Moses spoke, God's will was carried out. His body, even after death, represented God's unshakable authority over all creation. To Satan, possessing it was about more than just defilement. It was about challenging God's ultimate authority. The cosmic war between good and evil is never simply about flesh and blood. It's about dominion, control, and authority. Satan's rebellion was a direct challenge to God's rule. And here in Moses' death was another opportunity for Satan to undermine that rule. By claiming Moses' body, Satan was not just laying claim to a physical corpse. He was seeking to claim the legacy of God's covenant and the spiritual authority that came with it. He was trying to rewrite the narrative that Moses had lived, one that pointed to the law, to God's holiness, and ultimately to the coming of a greater deliverer, Jesus Christ. Why God protected Moses' body. God's protection of Moses' body was not just a response to Satan's schemes. It was a divine declaration of his unchallenged authority. When Michael, the archangel, was sent to battle Satan over Moses' body, it wasn't just about a physical confrontation. It was about preserving the sanctity of God's covenant. Michael's intervention ensured that Moses' body would remain untouched, a testimony to the fact that no power, whether earthly or spiritual, could defy God's will. By hiding Moses' body, God demonstrated that even in death, his covenant could not be defiled. The body of Moses was sacred, and by protecting it, God affirmed the permanence of his promises to Israel. No man, no angel, no force of darkness could claim what God had set apart for himself. The battle for the legacy of God's people. Ultimately, the battle over Moses' body wasn't just about one man. It was about the legacy of God's people. Moses had led the Israelites out of slavery, given them the law, and interceded on their behalf. He was the physical representation of God's faithfulness and God's authority. And so his body became the spiritual battleground in the war between light and darkness. God's refusal to allow Moses' body to be defiled was a powerful statement, that the covenant he made with Israel could not be shaken, that his law was immutable, and that his divine authority would always prevail. Even in death, Moses remained a symbol of God's eternal sovereignty. Moses' body, though it was buried and hidden from mortal eyes, carried with it a spiritual significance that transcended death. It represented God's covenant, his law, and his plan of salvation. Satan, knowing that he could not stop God's will, sought to defile it, an act that would have corrupted the symbol of divine authority. But in his wisdom, God preserved Moses' body as a sign that no matter what Satan sought to destroy, God's purposes would stand. The battle for Moses' body was not just a celestial skirmish. It was a testament to the fact that no force of darkness can ever undermine the eternal authority of God. The body of Moses, hidden and protected, stands as a reminder to us all. God's covenant is sacred. His authority is unshakable, and his plan for salvation will always prevail. Moses stands as one of the most fascinating figures in all of human history, a man whose life was woven into the very fabric of God's redemptive plan for humanity. His story is not just one of miracles and divine encounters, but one that reveals the complexity of human nature, the power of divine intervention, and the ever-present battle between good and evil. Moses was the man who led Israel out of slavery, who faced down Pharaoh, who parted seas, and who climbed mountains to speak with God. His very existence was marked by the miraculous and the impossible, yet it was also marked by the raw and unfiltered humanity that we all share. His flaws, his anger, his doubts, his insecurities are woven into his story, reminding us that even the greatest of men are still human. And that is what makes Moses so relatable, so profound in his significance. He was chosen by God, not in spite of his flaws, but through them. When Moses died, it wasn't just the passing of a leader. It was the end of an era. He was buried by God himself in a place no one could find, which left the world wondering, why? What was so significant about Moses' death that God would take such care in hiding his body? The answer lies in the profound spiritual legacy Moses left behind. His life and death were not merely historical events. They were prophetic acts that pointed to something greater. Moses was not only the mediator of the Old Covenant, but he also foreshadowed the coming of a greater deliverer, Jesus Christ. Just as Moses led Israel out of Egypt, Christ came to deliver humanity from the slavery of sin. Just as Moses interceded for Israel, Christ intercedes for us, bridging the gap between a holy God and sinful man. Moses' death, his body hidden by God, was a symbol of the transition from the Old Covenant to the New. His life was a prelude, his death a necessary closing chapter, making way for the coming of the Messiah. And that's where the battle over Moses' body comes into play. Satan, in his insidious and relentless pursuit of defiling what is holy, sought to claim Moses' body, knowing that it was the last physical link to the law and the covenant. The confrontation between Michael and Satan wasn't just a celestial drama. It was a profound reflection of the ongoing spiritual war that has raged since the dawn of creation. The protection of Moses' body by Michael was a divine declaration that no power, not even Satan himself, could corrupt or destroy the legacy of God's promises. In the end, Moses' life and death aren't just about a man. They are about God's sovereignty, his covenant, and his eternal plan of redemption. Moses' struggles, his flaws, his victories, and his death all serve as a reminder that even in the face of human imperfection, God's purposes will always prevail. His life pointed to the need for a Savior, and his death, hidden away by God, points to the reality that some things are too sacred, too holy, to be left in the hands of man. Moses' significance lies not in his greatness, but in how God used his imperfections to bring about his grand design. And perhaps the most profound takeaway from Moses' life and death is this: God doesn't use perfect people. He uses willing hearts. Moses wasn't flawless, but he was willing to obey God, even in his anger and doubt. And in that willingness, God accomplished miracles. In the mystery of Moses' death and the protection of his body, we are reminded that God's plan unfolds in ways beyond our understanding, and his purposes are unstoppable. Moses' death was not the end. It was a bridge to something far greater. It was the closing of one chapter and the opening of another. And in that, we see the lasting legacy of a man whose life and death were never truly his own. They were part of a larger divine narrative, one that would stretch across generations and point the way to the ultimate Redeemer. And so Moses' legacy continues not in a tomb that can be found, but in the hearts of all who trust in the covenant God made through him. His story is not over. It lives on, and through it, we are reminded of the unshakable power of God's authority and his unwavering commitment to his people. Hope you enjoyed this video. For more videos like this, subscribe to this channel, comment, and share. See you in the next video.